of Americans who trusted government to do the right thing doubled right after 9/11. And it was that increased trust in government which became a Pandora's box from which so many evils have come out in the last 9 years. Bush and his team succeeded in creating a very simple-minded storyline for the war on terror. Good versus evil. Us versus them. With us or against us. And then Bush expanded that to the axis of evil. And since Saddam was kind of part of the axis of evil, he was as guilty as a 9/11 hijacker, then what's not to like? And it was fascinating how easily George Bush sold his war on terror as a war for freedom. That it was only 2 months after 9/11 that Bush effectively suspended habeas corpus. Bush issued a decree on enemy combatants, and he entitled himself to unchecked power over anyone in the world who he said might be a terrorist. After Bush's decree, it only took his word to have somebody seized and detained forever. And with Bush's original order, there was no check and balance. It was as if the word of the president was the word of God. And yet there was very little controversy about this in the American media. Bumper Hornberger, Jacob Hornberger, the Future Freedom Foundation, they were one of the few organizations that were out front vigorously opposing this from the get-go. There were a lot of conservatives who were in favor of it, and some of the libertarian groups were rather quiet about it, but not Hornberger and Future Freedom Foundation. Now, it's interesting that people would accept the idea that the president should be treated as if he's infallible, because if you look at the terrorist batting average of the U.S. government, since between 2001 and 2006, over 90% of the people who the U.S. government accused of being linked to terrorists were found not to be guilty. They were not charged with any terrorist link. And yet, even today, any time that the U.S. government makes an assertion, well, this is somebody who sent some money to somebody in Yemen who he shouldn't have sent, so they're a terrorist financer. It is as if, it is as if the accusation is the same as the conviction in the American media and with a lot of the American people. There were so many ways, so many sea changes in how Americans thought and reacted after 9/11. One of the most telling examples was in December 2001, Attorney General John Ashcroft informed America, to those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, your tactics only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and give ammunition to America's enemies. John Ashcroft was effectively saying that critics were traitors. And he was saying, John Ashcroft said, well, for those who talk about phantoms of lost liberty, well, Ashcroft at that time knew the government was already doing a lot of illegal things. It was already trampling the Bill of Rights in many ways. But it didn't matter that it wasn't a phantom of lost liberty. It was real lost liberties. The critics were still traitors because the federal government, Ashcroft and Bush, had become the incarnation of freedom. But people were not supposed to worry about that because, just as long as you weren't a terrorist, you had nothing to fear. And as soon as this idea was accepted, what the Bush team did was vastly expand the definition of terrorist. For instance, by 2003, if someone was a sweaty airport traveler, well, then they might be a terrorist. One of my favorite things was the Homeland Security Department bulletin, which warned police departments to watch out for anyone who, quote, expressed a dislike of attitudes and decisions of the U.S. government. So anyone who opposed the war on terror, well, they're a suspect. Now, lots of things have gone wrong for the government in the last 8 or 9 years, but one thing that's really boomed has been the terrorist watch list. There are now more than 1 million names on the different federal terrorist watch list. There was a friend of mine, I was curious about this. I called him up yesterday and had him cross-check the list of names of people who had RSVP'd for this on Facebook with Homeland Security, and he said there are going to be 14 terrorist suspects in the audience here. but Bob wasn't on the list. Yeah, well, you know, it's always good to cause audience chatter. So, now it's a sea change in American democracy, especially under Bush, and Obama's following the same way, to see how much self-governance is being subverted as the rulers frighten Americans into submission. George Bush was reelected in large part because his administration issued a heap of bogus terrorist warnings in 2004. These were warnings that even Tom Ridge, the former Pennsylvania governor and Homeland Security chief, even he admitted that these terrorist warnings were hokum. But the Bush team kept issuing them. My favorite 2004 terrorist warning was when the FBI notified law enforcement agencies of the risk this is just before the 4th of July. The FBI warned of the danger of booby-trapped beer coolers floating down the river. You know, it kind of made me think that maybe Bush and Karl Rove thought they had not locked up the NASCAR vote. But the thing about these warnings is, between late 2001 and 2004, each time that the U.S. government issued a terror warning, a terror attack warning, the President's approval rating rose an average of 3%. There was a Cornell study that walked through all these terror warnings and the President's approval. How much did Bush get reelected by? 3%. And he was running against John Kerry, so good God. Now, again, to see how the baselines have changed. People after 9/11 were told that government power is not a threat unless someone is a bad guy. And how is it possible to know who's the bad guy? Those are the people that confess during torture. And it's, once again, so many times after 9/11, I thought the U.S. government had gone too far. I thought, okay, this is it. Now there's going to be a backlash. Now there's finally going to be some pushback. One of my biggest mistakes was on the torture issue. In May 2004, when the photos from Abu Ghraib came out, and they were the most mild of the photos, there's far worse stuff the government has suppressed. When the memo came out from John Yoo that said that the criminal law and the Constitution did not apply to the president during wartime, when there were other documents that came out that showed that the torture was, a policy choice of the White House and the Pentagon, I thought there'd be a backlash. Instead, being a champion of torture has become a political badge of honor. And we are seeing this for some of the GOP candidates this year. It's sort of like a macho test. And it's a very perverse macho test. Because I would wager that every politician that's waved that in the air was never at risk of being taken as a prisoner of war by an enemy country. This is the major reason why we have this ban on torture, so our American soldiers don't get tortured. But for these politicians grandstanding, that's all sticky-uty. Another sea change that was basically ignored was in late 2004, the Bush administration announced that they would use torture confessions in judicial proceedings. And I was thinking, okay, I had to check my calendar because I didn't think it was 1475. But it seemed like things had slipped. And this has come up again and again in those Guantanamo hearings. The U.S. government has knowingly used evidence that was the result of torture. And I was rereading an old book a while ago on Francis Bacon, and he was the author of the famous essays, the mastermind of the scientific method, and there were so many. He was one of the greatest intellects England produced. However, he was also, I think, a Lord Chancellor, and as Lord Chancellor, he ordered torture to be used against the Protestant dissidents and others. And I was reading a book from the mid-1800s by Thomas Macaulay, History of England, and also his essays on Bacon, Lord Bacon. And Macaulay in the mid-1800s is talking about how Francis Bacon, one of the greatest minds of his age, fell so far below of what the standards for being human were at that era, because He was sanctioning torture confessions at a time when the vast majority of Englishmen recognized that was barbaric. And yet here we are, more than 400 years later, and the U.S. government is doing the same thing. It's using tortured confessions in judicial proceedings. And it's just, it raises questions about what idea of truth is people are willing to accept. It is almost as if, as long as some government official is willing to stand up in front of a microphone and spew some lie, then we have to accept it as truth. Actually, this seems to be the standard for our foreign policy for quite a few years now. But that's a different story. Another change in recent years. For so many years, it was a trademark of Americans that they were proud of their privacy, that they were proud of their own territory, that it was accepted that the government was on a leash. The Americans fought the British in the 1770s largely because of general warrants, because the British claimed the right to search in anybody's home, to search anywhere in that house, and they didn't need a warrant. They just had to say, we're looking for something that might be illegal. And Americans said it was impossible to reconcile that with the rights of a free man. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years, either the American people have become a lot more servile, or else the war on terror has simply brought out some of the cravenness out there. After 9/11, Justice Department and White House lawyers decided that the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on the warrantless searches were null and void at the President's behest. That if George Bush thinks the search is necessary, that's fine. And this was the Pandora's box, that the National Security Agency began warrantless wiretaps of thousands of Americans. Now, some people say, well, these are abstractions. These are just, well, again, if you're not a suspect, so on and so forth. But you have to look at the legal doctrines the U.S. government is proclaiming openly and in public. For instance, if someone's traveling back from abroad, even if you went to Niagara Falls, Canada, and you're coming back, Homeland Security Department announced 2 years ago that it is entitled to copy your entire laptop hard drive or all your cell phone data when you come back across that border. And in the Federal Register notice where they claimed this power, they stressed it was absent individualized suspicion. In other words, they don't need any reason to suspect you. All that's necessary is that you're an American and they're a government agency, a government agent, and, hand them your laptop, everything on it, boom. It's U.S. government property, it goes into your permanent records. Same with your cell phone. And actually, this is even broader because in the same Federal Register notice, it said the Homeland Security Department is entitled, this also covers, the papers, books, pamphlets, and written materials, commonly referred to as pocket trash or pocket litter. So basically, you're coming back from Canada or back from Mexico or back from Europe, and you have to empty your pockets, and the government can say, well, this is all ours. And as someone who's often traveled back from abroad, when I'm working on a book, I've got a manuscript with me about government crimes, often, not always. Just the thought that the government could, take that and keep it or copy it. It's such an utter travesty. And yet people are told that this new policy is designed to safeguard our freedom, or maybe to save us from freedom's enemies, except for the government. But it's interesting to put this in a personal light. Think of if you're walking down the street, here or in Philadelphia or Hanover, wherever, and you're carrying your laptop, and someone comes up to you and pulls out a gun and says, I'm going to copy all your files. This is something which would be seen as an act of war, much more so than a simple theft of your wallet or purse. And yet, I'm just puzzled that these have not become profoundly controversial. Now, it's interesting, it's interesting to see how the news media keeps lecturing Americans that they should be, that the answer is to trust the government. This is something which we saw a lot. We heard a lot about this with the Census Bureau. There was a lot more conflict about the census this year than in previous times, and so the media was going in overdrive to encourage people to cooperate with the Census Bureau. And I have to admit, back in 1980, I worked as a census taker out in the Ozarks, out in southern Illinois. And, it was a pretty good job. It was a lot better than working baling hay. A part of the thing that was fun about that is that people would tell me how much they hate the government, and then they'd give me a beer. It's actually, in some ways, my life hasn't changed in 30 years. But back at that time, if I had known of the Census Bureau's role in sending 100,000 Japanese Americans to concentration camps, I would not have worked for them. But the Census Bureau suppressed that. And it's only the last 10 years especially that it's come out. And this is something which the Census Bureau lied about forever. And they only admitted after a lot of documents have been found by researchers. And this is not ancient history. 7 years ago, the Census Bureau provided the Homeland Security Department with a massive list printout of what zip codes Arabs lived in this country. And this was at a time when there were some conservatives who were in favor of rounding up Arabs and putting them in concentration camps. But the Census Bureau said it did nothing wrong. And there's so much righteousness by most of the mainstream media and the Census Bureau on these things, but it's important to recognize a surplus of lies naturally produces a deficit of trust. And this is why Americans don't trust the federal government at this point. They've been lied up and down and back and forth on Iraq, on the surveillance stuff, on the census, and many other issues. Now, I guess a year and a half ago, many Americans voted for Obama because they were fed up with these intrusions and these scams. But now we're getting the same thing with even a higher price tag. Unfortunately, the same kind of collapses in government, on the limits of government power, are occurring around the world. There was a recent book called Freedom for Sale, which looks at what's happened around the world on these things. Now, 20 years ago, it was fashionable to talk about how democracy was inevitable, and how the spread of democracy, it was just like it was, the theme phrase in Washington was the end of history. Well, as soon as I heard that, I can't use that term in the family audience. But, let's just say that was a phrase that always hit my BS radar. And the sort of people that were talking about the end of history were very much in favor of preserving the American big government and increasing our interventions overseas. But this is the same kind of thing that's happening around the world right now. In Italy, the parliament is so craven, it's 3 times it's passed laws that gave the president there total immunity for any crime that he committed. And it's sort of like, so how exactly is this rule of law? Well, it's rule of law except for the president. I wonder if they had some Bush advisors on this. But and another interesting thing about Italy is the president there, Berlusconi. Just as long as he denounces the socialists, many Italians accept him as the incarnation of freedom. And he's even started a new political party called the People of Freedom, and his motto is, "We are the party of Italians who love freedom and want to remain free." And the most important thing is for the president not to have any legal liability. That's going to make sure that they're free. And similarly in Britain right now, surveillance is bad here, and it's gotten a lot worse. Britain is so much worse, it's almost head spinning. There are now more than 5 million closed-circuit television cameras sweeping the streets in Britain, watching for anybody violating any law. And what the Brits are now doing, in some areas they have drones flying overhead to watch for people that litter or might urinate in public or do some other offense. And some of these drones actually have loudspeakers. So someone can be walking down the street, going home after a few too many beers. He sees the fire hydrant. Next thing you know, there's a drone shouting at him for 100 yards high. And the arrogance of the British government, the surveillance, the British have the largest DNA database in the world, and they're continually finding new reasons to expand it. For instance, a British minister was saying that police should be allowed to take the DNA from anyone who was stopped for not wearing a seatbelt. And these are things that the politicians say in public. What in the name of are they saying in private, or what else are they planning? But just that they would put forward ideas like this, it's shocking to see how much crap people will take from their rulers. And people talk about self-government. Well, I mean, if the government has unlimited right to spy on you, and you're not allowed to know what the government's doing almost any of the time, you don't have self-government. It's a total mirage. And this is what Britain has become. This is what the U.S. is becoming. Well, that's the lay of the land. There are hopes. There are more individual Americans recognizing the perils. There are more people standing up, I think, and opposing government power. But it's too soon to know how it's going to work out. But I've been very surprised that there's not been a more vigorous backlash for all three of the last presidents. You know, it's interesting. There was a brief period after Waco when there were a lot of public protests, and there were a lot of the protesters who I would talk to at those gatherings. They'd be very well informed. They would understand the law. They would understand the details. I've gone to a Tea Party rally or two, and let's just say that the people there did not seem to be very bookish. There was a Tea Party rally in Rockville, Maryland I went to, and the folks there were opposed to big government except when it was warring, wiretapping, or waterboarding. And they were gung-ho for launching at least one more big war, and the real danger was anybody who said anything good about socialism. And because of that, so many of the Tea Party folks are as gullible as the day is long. I hope that the people who are informed and are savvy and are principled and have a long record of consistently standing up for freedom, people like Ron Paul, for instance, that more people would listen to him as opposed to the latest, cover boy for National Review or Rush Limbaugh, the latest person he interviews. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but things have turned around in this country before when they look really grim, and there are a lot of good individuals who are willing to go to the barricades. Jim Babb did an action today at the federal courthouse in Allentown, and standing up for the people's right to, free speech, among other things. And I hear of other things like that happening in Pennsylvania. And that's very encouraging. It'd be great if there were 100 times more. But maybe this is enough to start to turn the tide. I don't know. So with that, I'll draw the curtain of mercy and go for questions. Questions? Going once, going twice. Yeah.
All right. You referred to the Tea Party people as being not too focused. I had great offense with that.
Okay.
Maybe the Tea Party people are more interested in protecting themselves and the people they love, very decent people, than protecting people at Guantanamo who might possibly kill us. I don't think that the people in Guantanamo were just arrested off the street willy-nilly. I think they're there for a reason. I think because there's information.
What is the reason?
Oh, I don't know what the reason is. I'm not as intelligent as you.
No, it's not a question of being
intelligent.
intelligent.
I would rather protect myself and my family and the people I love against the terror that is coming with the Muslims. Because if they come over here, they're not just going to waterboard us. They're going to slit our throats and kill us. And so, good for the Tea Party people. They might not be bookish, but maybe they love more than you do.
Well, there was... All right. There was a survey done in April this year. I think it was CBS News, New York Times, that talked about the political opinions of the Tea Party folks, and most of them said they were opposed to big government. 57% of them, 57% at the same time that they were opposed to big government, said they approved of George W. Bush. Now, It's like a logical impossibility for me to oppose big government and approve of George W. Bush. 66% of them approved of Sarah Palin. And okay, Palin's in favor of torture, I think. She's probably in favor of new wars.
If I can save my family and people I love, most people just...
How is that going to make you safe? Which bastard? Which bastard? Wait. Which bastard?
Some Muslim bastard, protecting some Muslim bastard. Fine.
Which bastard? How is it possible to know who the bastards are?
Well, I don't think those people at the Congo were picked up willy-nilly.
They were ransomed often in many cases by the Pakistanis. Okay, are there other questions? Yeah.
When you talk about the role of the Internet in promoting maybe more awareness of liberty, maybe alternatives to the old media.
Yeah, there's a lot of encouraging stuff on the Internet. It's a lot easier to get information not approved by the Washington Post and the New York Times. And it's also possible to access foreign media. There's a lot of, like on the war in Iraq, the European papers tend to be a lot more accurate than the American papers, and a lot more courageous. Likewise for the recent events in the Middle East. There are, it was my hope that the Internet would already have been having a lot more political effect. And that a lot more people would be tuning into it to get a lot better informed. However, it's sort of like there's maybe 5 or 10 or maybe a little bit more percent that are doing that and are bringing a critical attitude towards it and can sift. And it's not just going to a left-wing site or not going to a right-wing site, but kind of, bringing their own judgment. But thus far, it doesn't really seem to pick up as much traction as I hoped it would. But there are a lot of great individual sites on the left and on the right. Future Freedom Foundation's got a fine site. Counterpunch is another good site. Some of the think tanks have got very good sites. It is encouraging that a lot of people have lost faith in the mainstream media, like the Washington Post, and to a lesser degree the New York Times, and television. I mean, it's hard to, almost no one I know trusts broadcast television at this point. So, of course, it's a flip side though, because there are more people who are getting good information off the Internet, but it's almost like that there might be more individuals who have become very slavish towards Fox News. And Fox News has been such a geyser of total delusions. There have been some decent people on there, and sometimes they're right, but it's just, there were surveys done of people's factual knowledge on the Iraq War, for instance, and the people who got the news from Fox News were just like, I think many of them thought that we had found WMDs and that Saddam was linked to 9/11, and I mean, it was amazing, but it's stuff that's induced intentionally. Yeah, talking about counterpunch, the question was, what do I think the prospects are for a left-right political alliance? I don't know. I mean, my first instinct is to say not good, but I've been wrong on these things before, and I wouldn't put that much weight on my gut feeling on this. There are some very savvy people on the left. There's some very savvy people on the right. It was nice Ron Paul's got some of the, early on, he got some of the most respectful treatment. I think probably by places like Counterpunch. I'm not sure on that, but there were a number of hard left sites that recognized that he was honest and consistent at the same time that Ron Paul was being vilified by most of the right wing. So, I'd love to see that happen on the right issues. I think maybe one thing that's happened that might lead that is I think a lot of left-wingers are becoming very disillusioned with Obama, rightfully so. So, yeah, okay. The gentleman said he'd been to several Tea Party events. He had a question, not so much as far as torture, but whether I felt that that the suspects deserved a Miranda warning. You know, that's a very different thing than torture. I would think it'd be possible to. I don't know what the Geneva Convention says on that, as far as whether a person needs to be notified of their right to remain silent, or whether there's any such right under international law on prisoners. So I think that's a fairly minor issue, and it's not one which I would have a great deal of concern with one way or the other. So, well, it's possible. It's certainly possible. Another president could do that. I think if someone like Ron Paul or maybe Russ Feingold was elected, neither one of them will be. But excuse me. So there you go. Part of my frustration in how the American public has reacted during the last 7-8 years is that the suspension of habeas was not an issue. It was, and there were so many people that the only evidence necessary to justify locking somebody up forever was that one government official said one bad thing about him. And as soon as you let people get locked up forever because one government official said one bad thing, then the government has absolute power. And this is what there was a federal court decision last year on the Guantanamo cases, and the federal judges have done backflips trying to help out the Pentagon with the prosecution. But so many times the Pentagon's evidence it's not even smoke. And there was a case in which the key evidence was a simple assertion with nothing to back it up, and the court went back to the Pentagon. What's your evidence? The Pentagon said again, and then they said again. And the appeals court said, saying something thrice doesn't make it so. And sometimes that could almost be the motto for the entire war on terror. Because government has said BS again and again, and so many Americans are so deferential. That's the fundamental problem. Americans have become more deferential to the federal government. At the same time, the federal government has become far more dishonest, abusive, and intrusive. Why would this make people more deferential? Some days it almost makes me cynical.
Thank you, Jim.